This is the 1Book2Schools reading of Flora and Ulysses for Thursday, January 19th, beginning on page 109, Chapter 34, The Getaway. They were making their getaway, but they were making their getaway slowly. Because even when Flora's father was thinking that things were hilarious, even when he was talking like a parakeet, he still, apparently, did not believe in speeding. Flora kept looking behind them to see if they were being followed by the cops, or Rita and Ernie. When she finally looked down at Ulysses, his eyes were still closed, and a terrible thought occurred to her. "What if he has a concussion?" she said to her father. Her father, of course, laughed. Flora tried to remember that terrible things can happen to you, said about concussions. There was something about making the person with the head injury speak a favorite nursery rhyme, so that speech patterns, slurring, etc. could be evaluated. Flora stared at the squirrel. He couldn't speak. Also, she doubted he knew any nursery rhymes. There was a very small cut on his head, but the bleeding had stopped, and he was breathing softly, regularly. "Ulysses," she said. And then she remembered in its entirety an ominous sentence from Terrible Things. It is absolutely imperative that you keep the potentially concussed patient awake at all times. She shook the squirrel gently. His eyes stayed closed. She shook him harder, and he opened his eyes and then closed them again. Flora's heart thudded once, and then dropped all the way down to her toes. She was suddenly terrified. "Do superheroes die?" she said out loud. Her father stopped laughing. "Listen," he said. "We won't let him die." Flora's heart thudded again, a different kind of thud. It wasn't fear this time. It was hope. "Does that mean that you won't try to hit him over the head with a shovel?" she said. "I won't," said her father. "Ever?" "Ever." "You promise?" "I promise." Her father looked at her in the rear-view mirror. Flora looked back. "Let's go to your place, then," she said. "He'll be safe there." At these words, George Buckman started laughing hysterically. Again. That's the end of Chapter 34. Thanks for listening. Promise. Her father looked at her in the rear-view mirror. Flora looked back. "Let's go to your place, then," she said. "He'll be safe there." At these words, George Buckman started laughing hysterically. Again. That's the end of Chapter 34.
111, Chapter 35. Fear Smells. Flora's father never walked through the hallways of the Blixen Arms. He ran. And Flora Buckman, holding her possibly concussed squirrel, ran with him. Flora and George Buckman ran because the Blixen Arms was owned and managed by a man named Mr. Claus, who was in possession of an enormous, angry orange cat, also named Mr. Claus. The cat, Mr. Claus, prowled the hallways of the Blixen Arms, peeing on the residents' doors and vomiting in the stairwells. Mr. Claus was also notorious for hiding in the green gloom of the hallways and waiting until some unlucky person stepped out of the door of his or her apartment, or into the main entrance of the Blixen Arms, or down into the basement laundry room, and then pouncing on the person's ankles, biting and scratching and growling, and sometimes, weirdly enough, purring. Flora's father's ankles were deeply scarred. "The cat can smell your fear!" Flora shouted as she ran. "It's a scientific fact!" She had read about fear in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. Fear smells, said terrible things, and the smell of fear further incites the predator. Ahead of her, her father laughed his hearty and seemingly endless laugh. If Flora had more time, she would have said, "For the love of Pete, what's so funny?" But she didn't have time. There was a squirrel to save. And seemingly endless laugh. If Flora had more time, she would have said, "For the love of Pete, what's so funny?" But she didn't have time. There was a squirrel to save.
Chapter 36. Surprise, Anger, Joy. Flora stood and stared at the sign on apartment 267. It was made of fake wood and engraved with the white letters that spelled out the words residing within Dr. Measham. What was the apostrophe doing there? Did the doctor own the Measham? And what was with the exclamation marks? Did people not know what they were for? Surprise, anger, joy. That's what exclamation marks were for. They had nothing to do with who resided where. But at this particular moment, the exclamation mark seemed entirely appropriate. It was terribly exciting that a doctor who didn't know how to use apostrophes lived in apartment 267. "What are you staring at?" said her father. He was putting his key into the door of apartment 271. And he was laughing softly. "A doctor lives here," said Flora. "Dr. Measham," said her father. "I'm going to see if he can help with Ulysses," said Flora. "Excellent idea," said her father. He opened the door of his apartment. He looked to the left and then to the right. "Keep your eyes open for Mr. Claus," he said. "I'll join you in a bit." He slammed the door just as Flora raised her hand to knock on Dr. Measham's door. But she didn't get the chance to knock. The door swung open of its own accord. An old lady stood there smiling, her dentures glowing white in the perpetual green twilight of the hallway. Someone inside the apartment was screaming. No, someone was singing. It was opera music. "At last," said the old lady. "I'm so glad to see your face." Flora turned and looked behind her. "I am speaking to you, little flower." "Me?" said Flora. "Yes, you, little flower. Flora Bell, beloved of your father, Mr. George Buckman. Come in, little flower, come in." "Actually," said Flora, "I'm looking for a doctor. I have a medical emergency." Of course," said the old woman. "We are, all of us, medical emergencies. You must come in now. I have been waiting for so long." She reached out and yanked Flora over the threshold of 267 into the apartment. The criminal element had a lot to say about entering the home of a stranger. They suggest that you do so at your own risk, and that if you did make the questionable decision to enter the home of someone you didn't know, a door to the outside world should be left open at all times to facilitate a quick escape. The old lady slammed the door shut. The opera music was very loud now. Flora looked down at the hand that was on her arm. It was spotted and wrinkled. "Beloved," thought Flora. "Me?" That's the end of chapter 36. Thanks for listening. I wonder what will happen next. The old lady slammed the door shut. The opera music was very loud now. Flora looked down at the hand that was on her arm. It was spotted and wrinkled. "Beloved," thought Flora. "Me?" That's the end of chapter 36. Thanks for listening. I wonder what will happen next. Chapter 37. Singing with the Angels. He woke with a single giant watery eye staring at him. He blinked. His head hurt. The gigantic eye was mesmerizing and beautiful. It was like staring at a small planet, a whole sad and lonely world. Ulysses found it hard to look away. He stared at the eye, and the eye stared back. Was he dead? Had he been hit over the head with a shovel? He could hear someone singing. He knew he should be afraid, but he didn't feel afraid. So much had happened to him in the last 24 hours that somewhere along the way he had stopped worrying. Everything had become interesting as opposed to worrisome. If he was dead, well, that was interesting too. My eyesight is not what it was, said a voice. When I was a girl in Blundermeakin, I could read the sign before anyone else saw the sign. Not that it helped me seeing things clearly. Sometimes it is safer not to see. In Blundermeakin, the words on the sign were often not the truth. And I ask you, what good does it do you to read the words of a lie? But that is a different story. I will tell you that story later. I find this magnifying glass to be of great assistance. Yes, I see him. He is very much alive. I know he's alive, said another voice. I can tell that. Flora was here with him. How comforting. Yes, I see. He is a squirrel. For the love of Pete, said Flora. I know he's a squirrel. He is missing much fur, said the voice. What kind of doctor are you? Said Flora. The voices in the room kept singing. They were full of sadness and love and desperation. The voice belonging to the giant eye hummed along with them. Ulysses tried to get to his feet. A gentle hand pushed him back. I am Dr. Meacham. Who is the doctor of philosophy? Said the voice. My husband, the other Dr. Meacham, was the medical doctor, but he has passed away. This is a euphemism, of course. I mean to say that he is dead. He is departed from this world. He is elsewhere and singing with the angels. Ha! There is another euphemism. Singing with the angels. I ask you, why is it so hard to stay away from euphemisms? They creep in always in an attempt to make the difficult things more pleasing. So, let me try again. He is dead. The other Dr. Meacham, the medical one, and I hope that he is somewhere singing, perhaps singing something from Mozart. But who knows where he is and what he's doing? For the love of Pete, said Flora again, I need a medical doctor. Ulysses might have a concussion. Shh, calm. Why are you so agitated? There is no need for worry. You are worried about what? You will tell me what happened that makes you think concussion. He hit a door, said Flora, with his head. Yes. This could give a concussion. When I was a girl in Blundermeakin, people were often getting concussions. Gifts from the trolls, you understand. Gifts from the trolls, said Flora. What are you talking about? Looking at him, does he look like he has a concussion? The gigantic eye of Dr. Meacham came closer, much closer. It studied him. The beautiful voice sang. Dr. Meacham hummed. Ulysses felt strangely peaceful. If he spent the rest of his life being stared at by a giant eye and hummed over, things could be worse. The pupils of his little eyes are not dilated, said Dr. Meacham. Dilated pupil, said Flora. I couldn't remember that one. So this is good. This is a hopeful sign. Next, we will see if he remembers what happened. We will check for amnesia. Flora's face came into view. He was glad to see her and her round head. Ulysses, she said, do you remember what happened? Do you remember being in the giant donut? Did he remember being in Rita's hair? Did he remember Rita screaming? Did he remember the man with the knife? Did he remember flying? Did he remember hitting his head very hard? Did he remember not getting to eat a giant donut? Let's see. Yes, 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 yes. And yes! He nodded. Oh, said Dr. Meacham. He nods his head. He communicates with you. He's, different, special, said Flora. A special kind of squirrel. Excellent. Good. I believe this. Something happened to him. Yes, he hit a door with his head. No, said Flora. Before that, he was vacuumed, sucked up in a vacuum cleaner. There was a small silence. And then there was more humming from Dr. Meacham. Ulysses tried again to get to his feet, and was again pushed gently back. You are speaking euphemistically, said Dr. Meacham. I'm not, said Flora. I'm speaking literally. He was vacuumed. It changed him. Certainly it did, said Dr. Meacham. Absolutely it changed him to be vacuumed. She raised her magnifying glass to her eye and leaned in close, studying him. She lowered the magnifying glass. How did it change him, please? Ulysses stood on all fours, and no one pushed him back. You will speak without euphemisms, said Dr. Meacham. He has power, said Flora. He's strong, and he can fly. She paused. Also, he types. He writes, poetry. A typewriter, poetry, flight, said Dr. Meacham. She sounded delighted. His name is Ulysses. This, said Dr. Meacham, is an important name. Well, said Flora, it is the name of the vacuum cleaner that almost killed him. Dr. Meacham looked Ulysses in the eye. It was rare for someone to look a squirrel in the eye. Ulysses pulled himself up straighter. He looked back at Dr. Meacham. He met her gaze. You must also list among his powers the ability to understand. This is no small thing to understand, Dr. Meacham said to Flora. And then she turned back to Ulysses. You are feeling maybe a little sick to the stomach? Ulysses shook his head. Good, said Dr. Meacham. She clapped her hands together. I am thinking that Ulysses is not concussed. There is only this little cut on his head. Other than that, fine. Good. Great. I'm thinking that maybe the squirrel is hungry. Ulysses nodded. Yes, he was very hungry. He would like eggs, sunny side up. He would like a donut with sprinkles. Thanks for listening, and I wonder what's going to happen next. Ulysses pulled himself up straighter. He looked back at Dr. Meacham. He met her gaze. You must also list among his powers the ability to understand. This is no small thing to understand, Dr. Meacham said to Flora. And then she turned back to Ulysses. You are feeling maybe a little sick to the stomach? Ulysses shook his head. Good, said Dr. Meacham. She clapped her hands together. I am thinking that Ulysses is not concussed. There is only this little cut on his head. Other than that, fine. Good. Great. I'm thinking that maybe the squirrel is hungry. Ulysses nodded. Yes, he was very hungry. He would like eggs, sunny side up. He would like a donut with sprinkles. Thanks for listening, and I wonder what's going to happen next.
Chapter 38. Unremitting Darkness. You, said Dr. Meacham to Flora, will have a seat on the sofa and listen to the Mozart, and I will go and make us some sandwiches. What about my father? Said Flora. Shouldn't I tell him where I am? Mr. George Buckman knows where you are, said Dr. Meacham. He knows that you are safe. So good. All is good. You will sit on the horsehair sofa, please. Dr. Meacham went into the kitchen, and Flora turned and looked at the couch. It was a huge couch. She dutifully sat down on it, and then slowly, very slowly, slid off it. "Wow," she said. She climbed back up on the couch and concentrated on staying put. She sat with her hands on either side of her and her legs straight out in front of her. She felt like an oversized doll. She also felt very, very tired and a tiny bit confused. "Maybe I'm in shock," she thought. "Terrible things can happen to you," had done an issue listing the symptoms of shock. But Flora couldn't remember what they were. Was one of the symptoms of shock that you couldn't remember the symptoms of shock? She looked over at Ulysses. He was still sitting on the dining room table. He looked confused too. She waved at him, and he nodded back. And then she noticed that there was a picture hanging on the wall opposite the couch. It was a painting of what looked like nothing but darkness. Unremitting darkness. Unremitting darkness was a phrase that occurred often in the criminal element. But why would someone paint a picture of unremitting darkness? Flora slid off the couch and walked over to the painting and stared at it more closely. In the middle of all the darkness, there was a tiny boat. It was floating on a black sea. Flora put her face right up against the painting. Something was wrapped around the boat, some tentacled shadow. For the love of Pete! The tiny boat on the dark sea was getting eaten by a giant squid. Flora's heart protested with a small thud of fear. "Holy Pagumba!" she whispered. From the kitchen there came the sound of clinking silverware and crashing plates. The opera music ended. "Ulysses?" said Flora. She looked behind her and saw the squirrel sitting on the floor sniffing his tail. "Come here," she said to him. He walked over to her, and she picked him up and put him on her shoulder. "Look," she said. He stared at the painting. "This boat is getting eaten by a gigantic squid." He nodded. "It's a tragedy," said Flora. "There are people on board that boat. Look, you can see them. They're ant-size. But they're people." Ulysses squinted. He nodded again. "They're all going to die," explained Flora. "Every last one of them. As a superhero, you should be outraged. You should want to save them. Incandesto would." "Ah," said Dr. Measham, coming up behind them. "You are studying my poor lonely giant squid." "Lonely?" said Flora. "The giant squid is the loneliest of all God's creatures. He can sometimes go for the whole of his life without seeing another of his kind." For some reason, Dr. Measham's words conjured up the face of William Spiver, white-haired and dark-eyed. Flora's heart squinched up. "Go away, William Spiver," she thought. "That squid is a villain," said Flora out loud. "He needs to be vanquished. He's eating a boat, and he's going to eat all the people on the boat." "Yes, well, loneliness makes us do terrible things," said Dr. Measham, "and that is why the picture is there, to remind me of this. Also because the other Dr. Measham painted it when he was young and joyful." Good grief, thought Flora. What did he paint when he was old and depressed? "Now, you will sit on the horsehair sofa, please," said Dr. Measham, "and I will bring out the jelly sandwiches." Flora sat down on the couch. Ulysses was still on her shoulder. She put up her hand and touched him. He was warm. He was a small engine of warmness. "The giant squid is the loneliest creature in all existence," said Flora out loud. And then, to keep things grounded and in perspective, she muttered, "Seal blubber." And then she whispered, "Do not hope. Instead, observe." She kept her hand on the squirrel. Thanks for listening. "Please," said Dr. Measham, "and I will bring out the jelly sandwiches." Flora sat down on the couch. Ulysses was still on her shoulder. She put up her hand and touched him. He was warm. He was a small engine of warmness. "The giant squid is the loneliest creature in all existence," said Flora out loud. And then, to keep things grounded and in perspective, she muttered, "Seal blubber." And then she whispered, "Do not hope. Instead, observe." She kept her hand on the squirrel. Thanks for listening. Kept her hand on the squirrel. Chapter 39. The Tears Roll Off. Dr. Measham came out of the kitchen holding a pink plate with small sandwiches on it. She sat down next to Flora. "You are enjoying the horsehair sofa," she said to Flora. "I guess," said Flora. She wasn't sure exactly how someone enjoyed a horsehair sofa. "You will eat a jelly sandwich," said Dr. Measham. She extended the plate to Flora. Ulysses leaped off Flora's shoulder and into her lap. He sniffed the plate. "Our patient is hungry," said Dr. Measham. "He never had breakfast," said Flora. She took 2 sandwiches and handed one to Ulysses. "This sofa," said Dr. Measham, "is the sofa of my grandmother. She was born on this sofa, in Blundermeason. She lived the whole of her life there, and she is buried there in a dark wood. But that is a different story. What I meant to say is that when I was a girl in Blundermeason, I sat on this sofa and spoke with my grandmother about inconsequential things well into the gloom of the evening. That is what a girl in Blundermeason did in those days. She was expected to speak of inconsequential things as the gloom of the evening descended. Also, she must knit. Always the gloom is descending in Blundermeason. Always, always one is knitting outfits for the little trolls." "What little trolls?" said Flora. "And where's Blundermeason?" "Never mind about the trolls for now. I meant only to say that life was very gloomy then, and one was always knitting." "It sounds lousy," said Flora. "It was exactly this, lousy," said Dr. Measham. She smiled. Her dentures were very bright. There was a smear of grape jelly on one of her fake incisors. Flora reached for another sandwich. Had "terrible things can happen to you" ever warned against eating jelly sandwiches in the house of a woman from Blundermeason? "Your father is a lonely man," said Dr. Measham. "Also very sad. To leave you. This broke his heart." "It did?" said Flora. Yes. Mr. George Buckman has sat on this horsehair sofa many times. He has talked of his sadness. He has wept. This sofa has seen the tears of many people. It is a sofa that is good for tears. They roll off it, you see." Her father had sat on this couch and wept as the gloom of the evening descended? Flora suddenly felt like she might cry too. What was wrong with her? "Seal blubber," she thought. The words steadied her. She handed another sandwich to Ulysses. "Your father is very capacious of heart," said Dr. Measham. "Do you know what this means?" Flora shook her head. "It means the heart of George Buckman is large. It is capable of containing much joy and much sorrow." "Oh," said Flora. For some reason, she heard William Spiver's voice saying that the universe was a random place. "Capacious heart," said Dr. Measham's voice. "Random universe," said William Spiver's. Capacious, random, heart, universe. Flora felt dizzy. "I'm a cynic," she announced for no particular reason, and in a too loud voice. "Bah, cynics," said Dr. Measham. "Cynics are people who are afraid to believe." She waved her hand in front of her face as if she were brushing away a fly. "Do you believe in things?" said Flora. Yes, I believe," said Dr. Measham. She smiled her too bright smile again. "You have heard of Pascal's wager?" "No," said Flora. "Pascal," said Dr. Measham, "had it that since it could not be proven whether God existed, one might as well believe that he did, because there was everything to gain by believing and nothing to lose. This is how it is for me. What do I lose if I choose to believe? Nothing. Take this squirrel, for instance, Ulysses. Do I believe he can type poetry? Sure, I do believe it. There is much more beauty in the world if I believe such a thing is possible." Flora and Dr. Measham looked at Ulysses. He was holding half a sandwich in his front paws. There were blobs of grape jelly in his whiskers. "Do you know what a superhero is?" said Flora. "Sure, I know what a superhero is." "Ulysses is a superhero," said Flora. "But he hasn't really done anything heroic yet. Mostly he's just flown around. He lifted a vacuum cleaner over his head. He wrote some poetry. He hasn't saved anyone, though. And that's what superheroes are supposed to do, save people. Who knows what he will do, said Dr. Measham. Who knows whom he will save? So many miracles have not yet happened. Flora watched as one of the jelly blobs on Ulysses' whiskers trembled and fell in slow motion to the horsehair sofa. All things are possible, said Dr. Measham. When I was a girl in Blundermeason, the miraculous happened every day. Or every other day. Or every third day. Actually, sometimes it did not happen at all, even on the third day. But still, we expected it. You see what I'm saying? Even when it didn't happen, we were expecting it. We knew the miraculous would come. There was a knock at the door. See, said Dr. Measham, this'll be your father, Mr. George Buckman. Flora stood and went to the door and opened it. It was her father, and he was smiling again. Still, which did seem kind of miraculous. Hi, Pop, she said. You see, said Dr. Measham, he smiles. Flora's father's smile got bigger. He took off his hat. He bowed. George Buckman, he said, how do you do? Flora couldn't help it. She smiled too. She was still smiling when a noise that sounded like the end of the world echoed through the hallway of the Blixen Arms. 1 minute her father was standing there with his hat in his hand, smiling, and the next minute Mr. Claus, the cat one, came out of nowhere and landed right on top of George Buckman's unprotected head. I wonder what's going to happen next. It was her father, and he was smiling again. Still, which did seem kind of miraculous. Hi, Pop, she said. You see, said Dr. Measham, he smiles. Flora's father's smile got bigger. He took off his hat. He bowed. George Buckman, he said, how do you do? Flora couldn't help it. She smiled too. She was still smiling when a noise that sounded like the end of the world echoed through the hallway of the Blixen Arms. 1 minute her father was standing there with his hat in his hand, smiling, and the next minute Mr. Claus, the cat one, came out of nowhere and landed right on top of George Buckman's unprotected head. I wonder what's going to happen next. Buckman's unprotected head. I wonder what's going to happen next.